Chapter 1. Our Transgender Moment. Before the primetime interview of Bruce Jenner, as he was then called, by Diane Sawyer on ABC's 2020 and 2015, many Americans had never had a conversation about transgender issues. It's a conversation we need to have, as radical doctrines of gender spread through the culture, into our schools and public policy. But political and cultural elites have tried to shut down the discussion before it starts by imposing a politically correct orthodoxy on the nation, an ideology in which gender identity is both a subjective matter and a category meriting civil rights protection. The Jenner interview wasn't the first media effort to normalize transgender identity, but it had an especially big impact. For one thing, it involved the celebrity Kardashian family. More surprisingly, it was about a famous Olympian, a decathlon champion who had been an image of powerful masculinity to millions of Americans. There was also the timing of the interview, the weekend before oral arguments at the Supreme Court on same-sex marriage. This allowed LGBT activists to emphasize a unity of purpose between the T and the LGB parts of their constituency, to the consternation of many gay and lesbian Americans who feel that gender identity and sexual orientation have little in common. But the conjunction of events helped to represent the demands of transgender activists as another civil rights issue. Indeed, shortly after the Supreme Court redefined marriage, the Obama administration redefined sex to mean gender identity in our nation's civil rights laws and then imposed these gender identity policies on schools and health care providers. The transgender cause was officially mainstream. Normalizing transgender identities in popular culture. Though the Jenner interview made a big splash, a series of earlier media events had been preparing the ground for our transgender moment. One was the premiere of Becoming Chaz at the Sundance Film Festival and on the Oprah Winfrey Network in 2011. The film tells the story of how Chastity Bono, the daughter of Sonny and Cher Bono, transitioned to identify as a man, called Chaz, at age 40. Media reports were punctilious in using the correct pronouns, encouraging viewers to follow Chaz Bono through a significant part of the process that took place in 2010, including hormone treatments and the surgical removal of his breasts. His breasts. These elocutions are popular in the media, giving us headlines like "First Ever Pregnant Man" and "What It's Like to Chest Feed." Chastity Bono had been only a second-hand celebrity, by contrast with Jenner, but many people saw Chaz on Dancing with the Stars in the autumn of 2011. The gender identity theme made its way into TV dramedy in 2013 with the popular Netflix show Orange is the New Black, featuring a transgender actor, Laverne Cox, in the role of a transgender prisoner. In 2014, Cox became the first person who openly identifies as transgender to appear on the cover of Time magazine and the first to be nominated for an Emmy Award. Cox, a man who identifies as a woman, was named Woman of the Year for 2014 by Glamour magazine, whose editors declared that Cox teaches us that gender identity lives, first and foremost, in our hearts and minds. When the Chicago Sun-Times published a syndicated op-ed by Kevin Williamson pointing out that Cox was in fact not a woman, activists forced the newspaper to retract the column and apologize. Dissent is not tolerated in the transgender moment. Earlier in 2014, Amazon Studios released a web TV comedy called Transparent about a father transitioning to become a mother. The producer aimed to promote transgender identity behind the scenes as well as on screen. Bathrooms were labeled as gender neutral, and a transformative action program gave preference to transgender candidates for all positions working on the show. But the lead character, a transgender woman, was played by a cisgender man, which created some controversy. That lead actor and the show's director both won Emmys in September 2016. Around that time, the director, Jill Soloway, said in an interview, "The time has come where it's unacceptable for cis men to play trans women. It's pretty ironic coming from me, where I have a television show where a cis man plays a trans woman." Several other significant media events happened in the meantime, including the ABC special with Bruce Jenner in April 2015, and in July a cover story titled "Call Me Caitlyn" in Vanity Fair. Also in July, Jenner won the Arthur Ashe Courage Award from ESPN. Later that year came the Woman of the Year award from Glamour, which explained this choice by noting that Jenner made the decision to transition publicly so that in the future, kids don't have to wait until they're 65 years old to discover who they are. In the eyes of the mass media, a Woman of the Year award going to a biological man for the second consecutive year was less controversial than Jenner identifying as a Republican. Jenner also launched his own documentary series, I Am Kate, but it lasted only 2 seasons. A cable reality show called I Am Jazz entered its third season in 2017, profiling a teenage boy, Jazz Jennings, who identifies as a girl. Diagnosed with gender dysphoria at age 4 and socially transitioned at 5, Jazz had been promoted as a model for transgender children for several years already. There was an interview by Barbara Walters in 2007, a documentary in 2011, a book titled I Am Jazz in 2014, and another book in 2016, Being Jazz, My Life as a Transgender Teen. The first book, I Am Jazz, is marketed to schools across the nation for preschool through the 3rd grade. Being Jazz is marketed to teens. We will see more in the next chapter about efforts to indoctrinate children in the schools. The summer of 2015 was shaping up as the moment when transgender went mainstream, at least in the media, said Fortune magazine in reporting on a reality series that ran briefly on ABC Family. Becoming Us was a show presented from the perspective of a teenage boy whose father and girlfriend's father were both in the process of transitioning. Later that year came The Danish Girl, the film based on the life of Lily Elbe, one of the earliest sex reassignment patients. This film garnered the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress as well as a Best Actor nomination. National Geographic got in on the act in January 2017 with a special issue on what it called the gender revolution. 2 different covers were created for this issue, one that went to subscribers and another that appeared at newsstands. The subscriber cover featured Avery Jackson, a 9-year-old boy who identifies as a girl, the first transgender person to appear on the cover of National Geographic, the editors boasted. The cover text quotes Avery saying, "The best thing about being a girl is, now I don't have to pretend to be a boy." The newsstand cover has a photo of 7 young adults of various gender identities and expressions. Among the 8 people on the 2 covers combined, there are 3 boys or men who identify as girls or women, a girl who identifies as a boy, individuals who identify as bi-gender, intersex, non-binary, and androgynous, and even someone who is just male, but not one girl who is comfortable being female. Gender identity policies, public and private. While Hollywood sought to mainstream transgender ideology, the federal government mandated it. The Obama administration pushed gender identity policies as a matter of civil rights in various domains: education, healthcare, housing, the military. In 2010, before the media parade began, the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education issued a Dear Colleague letter redefining the word sex in Title IX, an anti-discrimination law passed in 1972, to include gender identity for the purposes of anti-bullying programs. The department would apply this new interpretation to school bathrooms, locker rooms, showers, sports teams, and dorm rooms in a series of actions involving the Arcadia School District in California, 2013, the Palatine School District 211 outside of Chicago, 2015, and the Gloucester County Public Schools in Virginia, 2015. Finally, in May 2016, the DOE and the Department of Justice jointly issued a Dear Colleague letter mandating that all public schools allow access to sex-specific facilities based on gender identity rather than biological sex. So Title IX, a law designed to protect women and girls from discrimination at school, would be used to violate the privacy, safety, and equality of women and girls. At the same time, in May 2016, the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Health and Human Services announced that a ban on sex discrimination in Obamacare was now being interpreted to ban gender identity discrimination. This would require all health care plans regulated under Obamacare to cover sex reassignment procedures and all relevant physicians to perform them. What was most remarkable about this new mandate was that it directly conflicted with the conclusions of the Obama administration's own medical experts. A month after HHS declared sex reassignment to be a civil right, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services released a report explaining that they were not mandating insurance coverage of sex reassignment surgery because clinical evidence did not demonstrate it to be beneficial. Based on a thorough review of the clinical evidence available at this time, there is not enough evidence to determine whether gender reassignment surgery improves health outcomes for Medicare beneficiaries with gender dysphoria. There were conflicting, inconsistent study results. Of the best designed studies, some reported benefits, while others reported harms. The quality and strength of evidence were low due to the mostly observational study designs with no comparison groups, potential confounding, and small sample sizes. Many studies that reported positive outcomes were exploratory type studies, case series and case control, with no confirmatory follow-up. So while the Medicare plans run by the federal government weren't required to cover sex reassignment procedures, the federal government's Civil Rights Office was requiring it of private insurance plans and physicians covered in those plans. Both the education mandate and the health care mandate were blocked by a federal judge before they went into effect. The Trump administration changed course from Obama-era policy at the federal level, but any policy made by executive decree can be reversed again by another administration. Other agencies also advanced a transgender agenda during the Obama years. The administration had once been willing to admit that granting access to sex-specific emergency shelters based on biology was not bigotry. That changed in September 2016, when the Department of Housing and Urban Development required shelters for the homeless and for battered women, among others, to allow access based on gender identity. No exemption was granted for shelters run by religious organizations. The military too has been swept up in the moment, and it now pays for sex reassignment surgery, even for convicted spies. Bradley Manning, sentenced to 35 years in prison for leaking classified information, announced himself to be Chelsea Manning, and the taxpayers picked up the tab for his sex reassignment procedures. In January 2017, President Obama commuted Manning's sentence. As this book went to press, the Trump administration was re-examining the military policy concerning people who identify as transgender. While the Obama administration was lenient on Manning, it had brought the full force of the Justice Department to bear on North Carolina, suing the state in May 2016 for allegedly violating the 1964 Civil Rights Act. At issue was the state's House Bill 2, a law under which access to bathrooms, locker rooms, and other sex-specific facilities in public schools and other government buildings is to be determined primarily by biological sex as indicated on a birth certificate, while private schools, restaurants, stores, and other businesses are free to establish access policies as they choose. North Carolina's HB 2, like similar bathroom bills, is simply common sense. It represents a reasonable compromise and makes accommodations for individuals who identify as transgender. For example, the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services noted that anyone who has undergone a sex change can change their sex on their birth certificate. HB 2 allows local school authorities and managers of government offices to provide special arrangements for people who identify as transgender, such as single-occupancy bathrooms or letting students have controlled access to faculty locker rooms. Such measures would protect women and girls from finding biological males in places where they expect some privacy, while also granting people who identify as transgender a safe place. Compromise policies of this kind acknowledge the reason we have sex-specific facilities in the first place. It's because of biology, not an inner sense of gender identity. Separate facilities are designed to offer privacy with respect to our bodies. Nevertheless, North Carolina's reasonable policy was attacked in the media and by the Obama administration. In announcing the lawsuit against a state, the Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, suggested that basing bathroom and locker room access on biological sex was as repulsive as basing it on skin color. It was not so very long ago that states, including North Carolina, had signs above restrooms, water fountains and on public accommodations, keeping people out based upon a distinction without a difference, she said. The Attorney General seemed to miss the fact that some distinctions do indeed make a difference. Whereas our skin color is irrelevant to which bathroom or locker room we use, our bodily differences as male or female are precisely why we have men's rooms and women's rooms. Liberal city and state governments also aimed to punish North Carolina for its bathroom bill. The mayor of San Francisco issued an order to bar any publicly funded city employee travel to the state of North Carolina that is not absolutely essential to public health and safety. Governor Andrew Cuomo did the same regarding state employees of New York. In response, Governor Pat McCrory of North Carolina asked how Cuomo's action with respect to HB 2 was consistent with his trip to Cuba to promote trade with that country. Is Cuba better on human rights than North Carolina? Or was Cuomo being a bit hypocritical? Meanwhile, big business piled on too. IBM, PayPal, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Salesforce all came out against the North Carolina law. The CEO of PayPal announced that the company was canceling plans for a $3.6 million expansion in the state that would have created 400 jobs because of PayPal's deepest values and our strong belief that every person has the right to be treated equally and with dignity and respect. Really? PayPal never explained why its international headquarters are in Singapore, where people who engage in private, consensual homosexual acts can face 2 years in jail. PayPal never explained why it announced in 2012 that it would open offices in the United Arab Emirates, which reportedly jails people who identify as gay or transgender. Even big sports jumped into the action against North Carolina. The NBA moved the 2017 All-Star Game out of Charlotte, a decision that was particularly amusing, given that the NBA and its sister organization, the WNBA, determine participation in their leagues according to biology. The NBA and WNBA are free to have gender-neutral basketball teams and to have gender-neutral restrooms at their games. That they boycotted a state in an effort to force a policy they haven't voluntarily adopted for themselves was the height of hypocrisy. Transgender medicine at Johns Hopkins. The most striking aspect of the transgender moment may be the influence of ideology on medical practice. Johns Hopkins Hospital is a prime illustration on account of its prestige and its history involving the treatment of discordant gender identities. The institution was a forerunner in offering sex reassignment procedures, largely due to John Money, a professor of medical psychology at Johns Hopkins University who in the 1960s advanced a radical notion that gender is only a social construct without any real connection to biology. Indeed, Money appears to have been the first person to use the term gender in this way. In the academic literature .30, he famously claimed to have helped a family successfully raise their twin sons as brother and sister after a botched circumcision destroyed one boy's penis. Money presented this case, along with findings from his work with intersex children, as proof that infants aren't born with a specific gender and that any child might be raised as either a boy or a girl, perhaps with medical assistance. In reality, the young boy raised as a girl always felt that something was wrong, despite all the hormones and surgery and social conditioning he was subjected to. When he was 14, his parents told him the truth. Both twins took their own lives in their mid-30s. Yet Money never backed away from his radical claims. A transgender activist might say that the tragic end for the twins only means that the one boy didn't really have a female gender identity. But Money's broader theory of gender as something separate from bodily sex would be influential in transgender advocacy. Money promoted his notion of gender fluidity across the United States, and together with a plastic surgeon he founded the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic in 1965. A young professor of psychiatry at Hopkins, Dr. Paul McHugh, tried to dissuade his colleagues from rushing into the fad of transgender-affirming treatment and sex reassignment. Decades later he recounted his experience. When the practice of sex change surgery first emerged back in the early 1970s, I would often remind its advocating psychiatrists that with other patients, alcoholics in particular, they would quote the Serenity Prayer, "God, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference." Where did they get the idea that our sexual identity, gender was the term they preferred, as men or women was in the category of things that could be changed? Hormones and surgery cannot actually transform a man into a woman or a woman into a man, McHugh argued. His colleagues responded by introducing him to patients they claimed had successfully transitioned. They thought that, if he met enough sexually reassigned people, he would come to see the benefit. But as McHugh recalls, none of these encounters were persuasive. For a while, he could simply avoid what his colleagues were doing in sex reassignment. Then he was promoted to head of the psychiatry department, so everything that went on there necessarily concerned him. I realized that, if I were passive I would be tacitly co-opted in encouraging sex change surgery in the very department that had originally proposed and still defended it, he wrote. McHugh believed it was necessary to know more about the results of the drastic procedures being recommended under his authority. I decided to challenge what I considered to be a misdirection of psychiatry and to demand more information both before and after their operations. McHugh encouraged John Meyer, a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst at Hopkins, to follow up with adults who had undergone sex change operations at the hospital and determine whether the surgery was beneficial in the long term. Meyer found that only a few of the patients he tracked down some years after their surgery actually regretted it, yet most did not appear to have benefited psychologically. They had much the same problems with relationships, work, and emotions as before. The hope that they would emerge now from their emotional difficulties to flourish psychologically had not been fulfilled. While the surgery may have provided some subjective satisfaction, it brought little real improvement in well-being. After studying the evidence, McHugh decided that sex change surgery was bad medicine and was fundamentally cooperating with a mental illness. Psychiatrists, he thought, could better help patients with gender dysphoria by trying to fix their minds and not their genitalia. Similar studies were conducted in Toronto and arrived at similar conclusions. With a better understanding of what was really being done through sex change operations, McHugh and his colleagues stopped prescribing those procedures for adults at Hopkins. Some of the hospital's plastic surgeons, he added, were relieved at no longer being commandeered to carry out the procedures. Dr. McHugh regards his profession as too inclined to chase fads and bend to political pressure instead of adhering to objective science. When patients claim to have discovered a true sexual identity at odds with their body, psychiatrists focus on preparing them for surgery and for a life in the other sex, which he considers a distraction from trying to understand the causes of their mental confusion. We have wasted scientific and technical resources and damaged our professional credibility by collaborating with madness rather than trying to study, cure, and ultimately prevent it. Medical professionals can be committed to an ideology just like anyone else. McHugh says that in his profession it is difficult to gain agreement, to seek empirical evidence for opinions about sex, and that there is a deep prejudice in favor of the idea that nature is totally malleable. A postmodern worldview is changing medicine from a profession that restores health and wholeness into a set of techniques to provide customers with what they desire. It is eroding the very foundations of objectively sound medical practice, as McHugh observes. Without any fixed position on what is given in human nature, any manipulation of it can be defended as legitimate. A practice that appears to give people what they want and what some of them are prepared to clamor for turns out to be difficult to combat with ordinary professional experience and wisdom. Even controlled trials or careful follow-up studies to ensure that the practice itself is not damaging are often resisted and the results rejected. The politicizing of medical problems is not good for anyone, says McHugh. Because actual sex change is biologically impossible, as will be explained in more detail later, no one truly benefits from the insistence that surgical intervention for that purpose is a civil right. Today, policymakers and the media are doing no favors either to the public or the transgendered by treating their confusions as a right in need of defending, rather than as a mental disorder that deserves understanding, treatment and prevention. McHugh suggests that our cultural confusion on the topic of gender identity is much like the famous Hans Christian Andersen tale, The Emperor's New Clothes, in which the spectators all pretend not to notice that the emperor in fact is not regally garbed but is strutting through the streets without a stitch on. They all worry that speaking an obvious truth would endanger their own social standing. Likewise, onlookers to the contemporary transgender parade know well that a disfavored opinion is worse than bad taste, so they shrink from stating clear facts. McHugh says, "I am ever trying to be the boy among the bystanders who points to what's real. I do so, not only because truth matters, but also because overlooked amid the hoopla stand many victims. Too many parents are finding no one, not doctors, schools, nor even churches, who will actually help them spare their children from the lifelong problems of transitioning. Truth tellers and healers are being punished by government and by society. In several states, McHugh points out, a doctor who would look into the psychological history of a transgendered boy or girl in search of a resolvable conflict could lose his or her license to practice medicine, but there is no penalty for putting such a patient on drugs to block puberty, which may cause a host of problems." Dr. McHugh's evidence-based approach to gender dysphoria prevailed at Johns Hopkins for a few decades, but in 2016 the hospital announced that it would start performing sex reassignment procedures again. This was not a consequence of new scientific evidence. LGBTQ Nation reported that the policy reversal came about thanks to mounting criticism against a respected medical center and faculty member and psychiatrist Paul McHugh in particular. According to Think Progress, the institution was trying to reclaim a reputation it once had as the leading academic medical institution when it comes to providing affirming care for transgender people, but it has nearly 4 decades of damage to repair. In short, political pressure and a shift in cultural attitudes explain the policy reversal at Hopkins. But changes in the culture don't all happen spontaneously by a kind of natural evolution, as is often implied by the very people who have agitated for those changes. The cultural shift that led to our transgender moment has largely been the result of a targeted campaign by transgender activist organizations. The Human Rights Campaign, HRC, a large and lavishly funded LGBT activist group, publishes a foundation overview documenting the work it has done to advance transgender rights on campuses, at workplaces, in medical institutions, even in houses of worship, aiming to force cultural and legal change. For example, HRC created a corporate equality index to push businesses to implement transgender-friendly policies, and it appears to be having an effect. In 2002, only 3% of Fortune 500 companies included gender identity in their non-discrimination policies, but 75% did so by 2016. In 2002, not a single Fortune 500 company offered transgender inclusive healthcare coverage, but 511 did so by 2016. Another HRC publication, Transgender Americans, a Handbook for Understanding, 2005, asserts that it is discriminatory to exclude from insurance coverage a certain kind of medical therapy for purposes of gender transition if that therapy is covered when used for some other medical reason by non-transgender individuals. For example, testosterone therapy will be paid for by insurance policies if a non-transgender man has a low level of the hormone, but a transsexual man who uses the same hormone as part of his medically supervised gender transition would not be covered. It seems lost on HRC that using a certain medicinal agent or technique for different purposes is not medically the same thing. In the view of HRC, it is unacceptable that transgender people must often pay out of pocket for lifelong needs, such as hormone therapy, or for expensive one-time costs, such as sex reassignment surgery, even when medical experts deem them necessary. Of course, the costs of the surgeries and lifelong hormone treatment are exorbitant, no matter who pays for them, and meanwhile many Americans have unmet needs for essential healthcare. The question of what medical experts deem necessary in cases of discordant gender identity is a matter of controversy. But as HRC boasted, those discriminatory exclusions in insurance coverage were gradually disappearing. Indeed, businesses across the country have been falling in line. Whereas only 13 companies had a perfect score on the HRC Equality Index in 2002, the count was 407 companies in 2016. HRC also created a healthcare equality index as a means of pressuring medical facilities to offer sex reassignment therapies. Making the grade became a bragging point for Johns Hopkins. In the summer of 2016, the dean of the medical faculty and the president of the Johns Hopkins Health System sent out a Dear Colleagues letter to mark Pride Month, noting that all 6 Johns Hopkins member hospitals achieved recognition from the Human Rights Campaign Foundation's 2016 Healthcare Equality Index. The letter also touted the decision to begin, once again, offering gender-affirming therapies for transgender patients. But that wasn't enough. After being awarded a perfect score on the Healthcare Equality Index, Hopkins scored considerably lower in 2017. The reason was that the institution did not publicly condemn Dr. McHugh and another researcher, Dr. Lawrence Mayer, over a report they published in August 2016, a 143-page literature review on what science showed and didn't show about sexual orientation and gender identity. HRC blasted their findings as transphobic. NBC reported that the conclusions of McHugh and Mayer had triggered an unprecedented review by HRC, along with warnings that the medical school would be removed from an elite classification in the Healthcare Equality Index unless Johns Hopkins officially disassociated itself from the literature review. A warning that HRC sent to the institution said, "Failure to take significant steps to distance Johns Hopkins medicine from this line of Dr. McHugh's personal beliefs and opinions will be considered an activity that undermines LGBTQ equality and patient care for the purposes of the Healthcare Equality Index score for Johns Hopkins Hospital." Note that HRC characterized McHugh's survey of scientific research as his personal beliefs and opinions. In the spring of 2017, HRC made good on its threat. As Jonathan Last pointed out, since no change of policy at Hopkins could account for a lower score, this action by HRC would reveal that the essence of the Healthcare Equality Index was mau-mauing, not science. HRC found a way around the problem. It changed the scoring methodology, particularly by adding a new criterion called responsible citizenship. Medical institutions could not earn any points for being responsible citizens. But they could be docked 25 points if the Human Rights Campaign decided that they had not been responsible citizens, Last explains. Of the 590 institutions in the 2017 index, you'll never guess which was the only one to be deemed an irresponsible citizen. Actually, you probably will guess. The scoring criterion of responsible citizenship was a patently ideological one. While activists have attacked the Mayor McHugh review, which will be discussed in some detail later on, they haven't been able to specify any errors or flaws. As Last observes, it's an extremely cautious document that relies entirely on published research and presents both sides of all arguments. If you had to boil Mayer and McHugh's conclusions down to a single sentence, it would go something like this: human sexuality and gender are incredibly complicated, a lot of what's presented as fact has no sturdy basis in scientific research, and we really ought to study the entire subject more rigorously. But even this modest, empirically based view is regarded as blasphemy against LGBTQ orthodoxy. Mayer and McHugh found numerous claims in that orthodoxy to be scientifically weak. They have insisted on a careful consideration of the evidence, free from political agendas. That's how science is supposed to work. Unfortunately, people who arrive at incorrect conclusions on hot-button issues can expect to be attacked and made to pay a price. Taking down an enemy. At least McHugh and Mayer got to keep their jobs. That wasn't the case for Dr. Kenneth Zucker when activists trained their sights on him. Zucker is a psychologist who ran the Center for Addiction and Mental Health (CAMH) in Toronto for 3 decades and directed its Gender Identity Clinic (GIC). He is perhaps the most frequently cited name in research on gender identity and the editor of the journal Archives of Sexual Behavior. Zucker has been at the forefront of developing treatments for people with gender dysphoria, and he headed the group that wrote the entry on gender dysphoria for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the official handbook of the American Psychiatric Association. Yet he was abruptly fired from the Toronto clinic one morning in December 2015, becoming a casualty of a campaign by activists who viewed him as insufficiently pro-trans. Never mind that he had recommended transition therapies for scores of patients over the years and had never tried to detransition a patient. He was targeted for his belief that children represent a special kind of gender dysphoria and that their long-term well-being may not be served by automatically encouraging them to transition. For that sin, he was subjected to a show trial by the hospital, CAMH. The World Professional Association for Transgender Health, WPATH, is partly responsible for Zucker's ousting. The organization objected to something published in the journal he edited, a Swedish study that found substantially elevated rates of suicide and other mental health problems among adults who identify as transgender even after hormonal and surgical transitioning treatments. WPATH pressured the study's authors to retract their conclusions, but Zucker refused to permit a retraction. He was attacked by activists, and then the Canadian government shut down his clinic. Transgender activists celebrated their spectacular victory in taking down one of their biggest enemies, as Jesse Singal reported in New York Magazine. That's hardly a conservative outlet, and Singal is a trans-friendly journalist, but his account of what happened to Zucker is fair and detailed. In his telling, the activists had won what seemed like a satisfying end to a simple sad story. Infamous reparative therapy clinic for transgender youth set to close, trumpeted Think Progress. Hooray! A big bad conversion therapy clinic for trans youth in Canada is shutting down, went the MTV headline. Good prevailed over evil, in other words. Those innocent children would never suffer again. But if you look closely at what really happened, if you read the review, which CAMH has now pulled off of its website, speak with the activists who effectively wrote large swaths of it, examine the scientific evidence, and talk to former GIC clinicians and the parents of patients they worked with, it's hard not to come to an uncomfortable, politically incorrect conclusion: Zucker's defenders are right. This was a show trial. In reality, Zucker was not doing reparative therapy or conversion therapy, but his clinic took a cautious approach to treating children. The clinicians viewed it as preferable for a child to become comfortable with his or her natal gender instead of beginning a process of social transition, a process that tends to become self-reinforcing because children naturally respond to the messages they get from parents and peers in society, Singal explains. A large majority of those children would eventually desist from their gender dysphoria, so why nudge them prematurely toward accepting a cross-gender identity? At the same time, the clinic often helped patients, especially the older ones, transition to their felt gender, providing a wide range of services that included hormone referrals. But activists demanded total capitulation. And the hospital capitulated, first by commissioning an external review, which Single describes as a markedly unprofessional document that takes many of the worst claims about the GIC at face value without bothering to check them. The most explosive claim against Zucker, that he had mocked one of his patients, calling him a hairy little vermin, was shown to be entirely false, which led the hospital to remove the external report from its website and substitute a toned-down summary. This possibly libelous charge was the most serious Single problem with the external review, but it's just one of many, Single remarks. It simply does not read, at any point, like a serious attempt to evaluate the gender identity clinic, and it is riddled with sloppiness. Judging from the evidence, it's pretty clear that the review was initiated to achieve a preordained result, firing Zucker and shuttering his clinic. This is all because the question of how best to treat gender dysphoria in children has become a focus of political warfare between those who understand it as similar to other dysphorias and those who insist that it should be accepted at face value as evidence of a fixed transgender identity as who the child really is. One strange result of this politicization, as Single comments, is that the professional psychiatrists who conducted the external review were concerned that it's harmful or improper to help patients in a mental health clinic understand why they are the way they are. If this concern were to be generalized across the field, it would render any mental health work harmful or improper. In the activists' view, Zucker's offense was to approach gender dysphoria in the same way as other psychological symptoms, such as anxiety or depression, trying first to understand the causes and then to resolve the underlying problems. Parents interviewed for New York Magazine were thankful to Zucker and his clinic for their services, Single reports. I spoke with 5 mothers of GIC patients, or former patients who went into CAMH to defend Zucker, out of the 7 parents who did, total, and they told me all about their experiences with him and his clinic. None was happy about the closing, and none could point to any examples of Zucker or the other clinicians acting unprofessionally or disrespectfully. Their children, all but one in their teens or younger, are in very different places, reflecting the wide range of clients who were seen at the GIC, but all of them, their parents insisted, had been helped by the GIC and what they said was a nurturing, exploration-focused environment. With one exception, the parents that Single spoke with didn't exhibit a whiff of discernible transphobia. One had a child who was continuing to identify as transgender, and another child was still ambivalent. Parents appreciated Zucker's methods and his care in looking deeper into their children's distress. But too many parents today are pressured to embrace the transgender affirmative approach, Single says. According to an influential strain of trans politics, Zucker's more nuanced, why-focused method is offensive. This sounds like a caricature, but right there in the external review that helped get him fired and his clinic shuttered, 2 professional psychiatrists state that asking why is improper. What needs to be done is to accept the child for who they are, and anything less than that is ignorant, if not bigoted. Simply accepting the self-declaration of a gender dysphoric child and encouraging persistence in a transgender identity does not constitute sound, science-based medicine. But politics now rules the debate. If one of the world's leading experts on gender dysphoria can be railroaded in this way, it means that medical practice is seriously compromised by an ideological agenda. Far from being a stable and coherent set of beliefs, it is an ideology that changes with political expediency, but what is lacking in logical coherence is more than compensated by the uncompromising zeal of its advocates. It's to this ideology and its promoters that we turn in the next chapter.